Hi all, I'm Conlin. I'm a Houdini effects artist and Gnomon alum, and today I'm going to show you a tool that I built with my peer Gabriel Martinez for Nuke, as well as its Houdini Copernicus port that I built. This tool allows you to sculpt the look and texture of your 3D renders. The tool is available for free on my Gumroad page, and the Nuke version can be installed just like any other gizmo in your .nuke folder. The Houdini Copernicus version is installed just like any other HDA. So, what does this tool do? Lens texture is something that is very important to cinematographers. They spend a long time deliberating over their lens choice, evaluating the way that different lenses capture the softness and sharpness of scenes. Here are some examples of images that have some very sharp detail, which is made possible by the lens and post-production choices. This sharpness is a specific choice, and it was chosen to suit the narrative and the taste of the creatives involved. For example, David Fincher prefers a very sharp look, and this image is from a show about survival, so the texture here really accentuates that struggle. On the other hand, sometimes a softer look is what is best suited for the image. In this case, while the background is obviously out of focus, the actress's face is in focus, yet still has a soft appearance. This is also the case in this still from Casablanca. In both of these images, the softness is what best suits the creative intent. In this case, Evelyn is a little bit disoriented, so this softness makes sense. And in this case, although it's a little bit of a more legacy approach, they wanted to make the actress's features appear very soft to accentuate her beauty. In CG, we too often disregard the idea of lens texture. While cinematographers are making very intentional, creative choices around it, we're not really thinking about it at all. Ignoring lens texture is actually a big mistake, as it's an extremely powerful tool. Aside from the broader aesthetic look that it can impart upon our images, such as the overall sharpness or softness, used spatially, it can actually make the image more readable and draw the viewer to what we want them to see. In this case, when our eye lands close to the middle of the image, attracted by these contrast points, the general softness of these larger areas, bordered by a little bit of this sharper side, draws our eye up through the softness towards the sharpest point of the image where his eye is. This is where we are intended to look, so the softness and sharpness of the image is drawing our eye towards the intended focal point. This is the same case for this image, where our eye lands kind of broadly near the middle and is kind of propelled through the distinction between larger soft areas and then a little bit of sharpness all the way to the sharp edge at the top here, which is our focal point once again. So how can we define or characterize the sharpness and softness of an image? If we imagine a painted wall with alternating black and white stripes in a wave pattern, and we thought about viewing this wall from a slanted angle so that we can see larger shapes towards us that get smaller and smaller as it recedes into the distance, we can think about this in terms of a low frequency on the left closer area and a high frequency on the right further area. Frequency is all about the size of shapes. So in this case, since the area that is closer to us has these larger waves that get smaller as they get further into the distance, we can think about this image as going from a low frequency to a high frequency as we go to the right. If we photograph this slanted wall with the camera, it wouldn't actually look like this. In fact, it would look more like this image on the left. And what's the difference here? We can see this wave, it goes from lower frequency to higher frequency. But the difference is the contrast. In this image, we can see that it goes from white to black to white to black to white to black, and it does this in lower frequency waves all of the way to a higher frequency shape. In this image, which closer represents what it would look like if a camera shot this wall, we can see that it goes from white to black to white to black, but then we can actually see it gets slightly less black, slightly less white, slightly less black, slightly less white. So what's happening here? As the shape is getting smaller and smaller, the black to white transition is getting reduced in contrast. It's getting kind of blurry and soft. We can plot this reduction in contrast where up here would be a region of high contrast and down here means low contrast. And we can see as we go from the left to the right, which is to say, as we go from low frequency to high frequency, our contrast line stays strong until we get to a certain point where the contrast lowers and lowers as the frequency increases. So what does this mean? We can see that our camera and its lens lose contrast at certain frequencies or detail sizes while they retain it at others. And when that contrast is lost, the image appears softer, and when the contrast is retained, the detail remains sharper. The way that an imaging system either preserves contrast or loses contrast, which is to say preserves sharpness or goes softer, is called the MTF curve, which just plots contrast over frequency size. Different lenses, shooting settings, camera processing, and post-processing techniques affect the MTF curve, which is to say that they affect the softness and sharpness of the image at different detail sizes. When cinematographers are specifically making choices around this, what they are doing is sculpting their MTF curve. As CG artists, we can take a page out of the cinematographer's book and sculpt our texture to best suit our narrative and creative intent. This tool allows us to sculpt our render's MTF curves, making us think more like cinematographers. It's based off of texture sculpting tools from professional DI packages, DaVinci Resolve, and FilmLight's Baselight. In Nuke, once we've installed the gizmo in our .nuke folder, we can update our plugins and then search for TextFreak EQ. This stands for Texture Frequency Equalizer. In Houdini, once you've installed the HDA, you can go to the Copernicus context via a copnet, which in Houdini 22 creates a geometry container first. In the copnet, if you search for Texture Frequency Equalizer, the HDA will pop up. The user interface between the Nuke and Houdini versions are identical, so this demo will jump between the two software, but the concepts apply to both. If we drop the node into our stream, we'll see that nothing happens by default, but that's because no settings are turned on yet. Let's explore the settings. At the top of the tool, we have a mode, currently set to standard. We'll keep it there for now. There's the Use Test Waveform option, which will give us a visual that is similar to the striped wall from before. I'll cover this more later. Next, we have our overall strength, followed by the output mode, which lets us choose between looking at our final result, some visualizers, or a technical tool that I'll cover later. Now, we just have these 6 sliders: broad, coarse, medium, small, fine, and micro. These are referring to size of detail, where micro is the smallest and broad is the largest. Moving any of these sliders to the right is going to sharpen detail of that size, and moving them to the left is going to soften detail of that size. So back in Houdini for now, let's take a look at these sliders. I'll leave the strength at 0.5 for now, and I'll start with broad. Moving it to the right will increase the contrast in the low frequency areas, and moving it to the left will decrease the contrast in the low frequency, large, broad areas. As I'm interactively moving the slider around, you might notice that it is a little bit hard to tell what changes are happening. This is something that is very important to understand about texture-based tools, including the ones in Baselight and DaVinci Resolve, which is that the changes we're going to be making should be quite subtle, and that our eyes easily adapt to whatever the image currently looks like in terms of its softness and sharpness. This means it is very important to toggle the tool off and on frequently while working to ensure the result you are getting is desired and not pushing it too far. So back to the broad slider, if I move it to the right, I am sharpening and increasing the contrast of very large, broad shapes in the image. And if I bring it to the left, I'm softening those shapes. And remember to always toggle off and on to make sure that the change that we're doing is not pushing it too far. One way that we can visualize the effect that we're having on our image is by clicking Use Test Waveform. This will override the input image with a wave of increasing frequency, similar to that painted striped wall from the earlier demo. If we increase the broad slider, we can see that just these low frequency areas are being stretched out and increased in contrast or sharpened, and moving it to the left will soften and decrease the contrast. And I wanted to quickly shout out Hallam Roberts or Mystery Pancake for help with the OpenCL code to rasterize the test waveform in the Houdini version of the tool. In the Nuke version of the tool, Use Test Waveform looks a little bit different because it doesn't directly rasterize the painted wall look into the wave visualizer. What we can do though is right click up here and create a window, new scope, waveform. One other thing that you might need to do is go to Edit, Preferences, Scopes, and then turn off Include Viewer Color Transforms and set the black point and white point to a larger range like -10 and 10. This will help prevent the waveform visualizer from getting clamped to SDR values. Once we've taken these steps, if we increase the broad slider to the right, we will see an increase in contrast and sharpness in the low frequency region of the diagram. And if we do the same for the left side, what we will see is a softening or decrease in contrast of those broad areas. Next, we'll take a look at the coarse slider. As a reminder, as we go from the top to the bottom, we go from very large shapes to very, very small shapes. So coarse is a step down from broad, but it's still pretty large in the overall scope of the picture. So when we go and actually move it to the right, we will sharpen and soften. And once again, these changes are going to be subtle. So let's turn it off and on and off and on. And we'll see that it is softening and sharpening relatively coarse detail. And if we turn on use test waveform, we can see that it's getting a little bit less of those low frequencies, but it's still relatively low frequency, just shifted a little bit more to the right. And with the medium slider, we're once again going a step smaller. Increasing it to the right will increase the contrast and sharpness of areas. And same with moving it to the left. And let's use the test waveform here. And now we'll see it's moved even further to the right. As we take a look at the small, fine, and micro sliders, I'm going to zoom in a little bit so that it is easier to tell the changes that we're making. As a related note, when you're making texture-based adjustments, if you're viewing the image on a small screen, it can be hard to tell the difference. So I apologize if you're watching this video on mobile. Anyways, with the small slider, once again moving it to the right will sharpen detail of that size, and left will soften detail of that size, and turning it off and on to view the before and after. And same deal with the fine slider and the micro slider, which is even smaller detail than the fine slider. Be careful with these sliders, as it can be easy to accidentally accentuate noise in the image because it is of the micro and fine detail size. Now let's talk about the tool in practice. Right here we have red sample footage, and let's talk about sculpting our MTF curve to suit our narrative. Let's say we have a case where in our narrative, this person is a very soft and angelic person. To suit the narrative, we might want to use our tool to soften the character for a more ethereal, soft look. So with this specific instance of the tool, we've especially softened the medium and small areas. But to make sure that we don't lose too much detail, we've slightly bumped up the fine and micro sliders. If I toggle the effect off and on, you'll notice some of these shapes are getting smoothed out, which might suit our narrative in this case. On the other hand, what if this person was going through a hard time and struggling? We might want to accentuate the texture of their skin in order to accentuate this. So what we've done in this instance of the tool is bump up a lot of the sliders, especially in the small and micro range. And then we've once again compensated, this time in the other direction, by smoothing out a little bit of the coarse areas. If we turn that on and off, we'll get a more textural, grungy feel in the skin, which might better suit our narrative. We can use the overall strength slider here to increase or decrease the strength, and also remember to always toggle it on and off to make sure you're not pushing too far. So far we've been sticking to the standard mode of the tool, which has the 6 predefined frequencies or detail sizes. If we switch to the single band mode, we'll be able to define our own frequency or detail size range to effect. The min size and max size are in pixels. So let's say we had the default sizes here, 10 to 80, and I wanted to soften the image. It's going to soften everything in between that detail range. If I want to affect a wider range of frequencies, I can increase the difference between the sliders, and I can also slide them around to target any specific range I want. One setting I have not yet talked about is the output visualize difference mode. This is going to visualize the difference between the original image and the version that's been softened and sharpened in order to make it more clear which areas are being affected. So if I set the sliders to 0 and 50 and then sharpen it a little bit, we can see the areas that are going to be sharpened. And then if I go to my final result and toggle it on and off, we can see this is indeed the case. If I change the pixel size to very large values, visualize the difference, and then soften the image, I can see that we are indeed affecting very low frequency, broad shapes. One use case of the single band mode would be to inject back detail of a certain frequency range into an image. In this case, we have a bilateral filter going on this image, which is something common in the beauty industry. The bilateral filter is kind of like a blur, but it better preserves edges so as to not distort the features. The bilateral filter has effectively smoothed out the skin, but in turn it has lost too much detail. If we look at the texture frequency equalizer, we can see that its output mode is currently set to raw band. Let's set it to visualize difference for now. This shows us that we're capturing very fine, high frequency detail, and we're specifically doing this between the size of 0 and 15 pixels. And we're specifically sharpening these details. If I set it to output the raw band, this outputs the raw frequency band data, which I can see if I expose the image up, there it is. And this can be added to the bilaterally smoothed image with a plus operation in order to inject or add back high frequency detail. Another use case of this tool is to apply color correction and color grading operations to only specific frequency ranges of the image. Let's say that with this image, we wanted to increase the contrast. Specifically, when I'm talking about contrast now, I'm not talking about the softness and sharpness of the image across different frequency ranges type of contrast that we were discussing earlier, but literally just increasing the contrast of the image like you would with a slider or some kind of tone curve. So right here, I'm simply increasing the contrast. And what more could we want from this? Why would would we potentially want to use the texture frequency equalizer in such a simple operation? Well, with a uniform contrast operation like this, we're increasing the contrast uniformly across all frequencies of the image. And going back to what we discussed about the relationship between contrast and sharpness and softness of the image, when we're increasing the contrast uniformly, we're also increasing the sharpness uniformly. This might not sound like an issue, but on our original image, we might already have areas that are quite sharp, such as these hairs, these pores or hairs here, or the texture on the shirt. When we increase the contrast uniformly, we're also inadvertently sharpening already sharp areas. In this stream, we're applying the contrast adjustment just to the low frequency portion of the image. This results in a nice increase in contrast without over accentuating already sharp detail. If we compare with the regular contrast, we can see that regular contrast really does sharpen already sharp detail, such as the skin, shirt, and hair. Versus with the low frequency contrast, we're increasing the contrast of the image without overtly sharpening it. This nice soft contrast might be a good choice depending on your creative intent. To achieve this effect, we're using the texture frequency equalizer set to the single band mode, filtering out detail between 0 and 30 pixels by softening it. Now that we have just the low frequency version of the image, we can divide the original image by that in order to get just the high frequencies. If we multiply the low and high frequencies together, we'll get the original image. But before doing that, we can separately adjust the high and low frequency streams. In this case, we're just going to adjust the low frequencies by applying that same contrast adjustment, except just to the low frequencies, so that when we multiply it back, we'll have that low frequency contrast adjustment that we discussed. A similar technique can be helpful when working with 8-bit or compressed images. Some operations will really highlight and accentuate artifacts from compression and low bit depth images. You might notice that these artifacts appear very dotty with small little flecky shapes. One way you could describe them is high frequency. So if we do the same technique by filtering out the high frequencies and applying the operation just to the low frequencies, then combining it back with the divided out high frequencies, we can get a result with the same method to avoid the compression artifacts. We can also use this tool to recreate the functionality of the texture highlight tool from FilmLight's Baselight. The texture highlight tool from Baselight is useful to remove color fringing and soften sharp highlights. On a standard dynamic range or SDR display, this light might not necessarily seem like it has too sharp of an edge, but if delivering for HDR or high dynamic range, this light might be displayed at a much brighter value than the background. And that huge contrast on a sharp edge like this could really draw the attention away from where the viewer is supposed to look, so the texture highlight tool is meant to soften that out. So similarly to the recent examples, we're going to filter out the high frequency detail, leaving us with just a low frequency version of the image, divide that out from the original image to get the high frequency stream, and whereas the other examples applied operations on the low frequency stream, we're actually going to be desaturating on the high frequency stream in order to reduce the color fringing on the edges. This brings up an important point. We're isolating the high frequency band in order to affect the light's edges. So far, we've been talking about high frequencies in terms of small dotty detail, but sharp edges are also a form of high frequency data. So by desaturating the high frequency range, that includes the color fringed edge. Now, when we multiply back the low frequency and the modified high frequency bands, we have this version of the image whose high frequencies have been desaturated. If we compare to the original, we can see that this fringing has successfully been reduced. The next step is to soften these harsh edges, which as we've just learned are included in the high frequency range. So I'm softening the fine and micro sized detail, which includes this sharp edge, which softens the overall image. However, the desaturation and softening of the high frequency range is happening globally across the entire image, not just in the highlights, which is what the texture highlight tool wants. This can be addressed simply with just a luminance key that's blurred and adjusted to your liking. That's then used as a mask to blend between the original and adjusted image. If we zoom in, we can see that we've successfully defringed and softened this sharp edge, just like the texture highlight tool from Baselight. The last use case of the tool that I'll cover today is applying it locally in masked regions in order to direct the viewer's eye. Earlier, we discussed how the pockets of softness and sharpness lead our eye to the focal point in this image. By applying the tool to masked regions on our image, we can similarly create pockets of softness and sharpness in order to draw the viewer's eye. This is similar to a painting technique called lost and found edges, where lost edges are soft and found edges are sharp. In this painting by Rembrandt, this bottom left cheek area is a very soft, lost edge. This opens up our eye to traverse into and across the painting all the way up into the sharp found eye. This is the focal point of the image. This sharp found edge of this color acts as a barrier to keep our eye from drifting out, keeping our vision in the intended focal area. Let's apply this philosophy of lost and found edges, or local softness and sharpness, to this image created by my peer Evgeny Magovsky. Evgeny's an incredible artist, and I would really encourage you to go check out his work. This is an early version of this shot that he lets me use to demo this tool, so be sure to check out the final work on his ArtStation. In this version of the shot, one thing I'm noticing is that the focal point, his face, isn't necessarily drawing my attention enough. It's kind of getting lost and soft versus some sharper areas over here are kind of distracting away from it. In order to address this, I've used the texture frequency equalizer to sharpen the image. However, this is applying uniformly across the entire image. So what I've done is I've created a mask, especially around the eyes and the face, and I'm blending in the effect of the sharpening. So if we look here and here, we can see I'm sharpening just the eyes and the face. This certainly helps, but now this newly sharp eye is competing with a few other areas of sharpness. I would say that this line between the hat and the window, this intricately detailed lamp, and even this sharp light edge below the eye are all kind of pulling our attention away from where I really want to look, which is the eye. I've once again addressed this by applying a global texture frequency equalizer, this time softening the image, and then blending it in once again using masks. If we look at the before and after, we can really see that the softening of these areas lets the eye shine as the focal point. And for finishing touches, I'm applying a global texture frequency equalizer, which softens out the low frequency regions and sharpens the high frequency regions. This balance of soft large shapes and more detailed fine shapes is something that is common in analog film. And that's how you can use this tool. My poor voice is very hoarse from all of these long recording sessions, but hopefully it gets used to that, as I'm hoping to make videos more often now. If you find the tool useful, please feel free to leave a rating on my Gumroad page on either the Nuke or the Houdini version, or both. I won't complain. But I sincerely hope that you found it as useful as I have to be able to sculpt the texture, modulation, transfer function, softness and sharpness, all of the above of your images. At the time of recording, I am also looking for work as a Houdini effects artist with additional skills in lighting, rendering, compositing, pipeline scripting and tool building, a 3D generalist background, and expertise as a tutor or consultant for digital color and color management. Please get in touch if you believe I would be a benefit to your team. Thanks for watching and have a wonderful rest of your day.